Funeral customs vary around the world, and America is a veritable melting pot for those customs. For anyone first immigrating to the U.S., it can be a bit intimidating to know what proper protocol is for the two most common types of funerals. Given that 46% of the U.S. is either Catholic or some denomination of Protestant, this can be particularly alien for immigrants from countries that do not commonly practice either of these faiths. Non-Christian faiths practiced in the United States represent less than 6% of religions practiced, including Judaism, Muslim, Buddhist, and other minor faiths. In fact, there are more non-religious practitioners or religions that are not affiliated with any kind of church at roughly 22% than there are of non-Christian faiths. As such, the focus of this presentation will be based on the two most prominently represented faiths. There are several key factors to determine the appropriate behaviors and actions to take for each of the two funeral types. For instance, Catholics tend to have a more somber and realistic approach to funerals, whereas Protestant denominations tend to take a more relaxed approach and have far less rituals and structure. The funeral mass follows a strictly formal liturgical pattern of prayers, scripture readings, homily, and Holy Communion. For example, you will see a priest greeting the coffin at the door of the church and sprinkling it with holy water. Whereas for a Protestant service, this will typically consist of instrumental music, a sermon, prayers, the singing of hymns, eulogies, and group readings from the Bible. One primary common factor for both religions is that towards the end of the service, there is typically a keynote speaker designated by the either deceased or the family of the deceased to deliver a eulogy, a speech that typically denotes praise for various milestones or accomplishments from the deceased person's life. In most Catholic funerals, there will be a viewing, which is often referred to as a vigil or a wake, depending on the location of where it's held. It can be held in either before or after the funeral mass, in which attendees of the funeral line up, family at the head of the line, followed by in succession by those from closer to looser ties. Typically, people at the end of the line will be the people that had the least first-hand knowledge of the deceased. Cremation is not very common amongst those in the Catholic faith. For Protestants, there is a viewing that is done within 3 days of the decedent's passing, and this may be bypassed if the decedent is cremated, which it's much more common for someone of the Protestant faith to be cremated. In both faiths, there is a funeral procession where the body and the cremated remains are transported from either the Mass, which is the Catholic Church, or the typical Protestant Catholic Church. They can also be coming from a funeral home to the cemetery for burial services. It is typical in both faiths for transportation of the remains to be a hearse, followed by vehicles transporting family. Often rented limousines are used for this occasion, and then they are followed by the remaining attendees of the funeral service or those going to the burial service. And those people will follow in their personal vehicles. Ordinarily, the hearse is preceded by 2 motorcycle cops to aid in the transport of the body and the continuing unbroken line of the funeral procession. This also helps to aid in directing traffic. During these processions, it is expected that all traffic will stop to allow the funeral procession to proceed to the cemetery without break or interruptions. They do not stop for red lights. They proceed directly through. All other traffic must stop in all directions. Now, this would actually be something that differs from other Catholic traditions or other Protestant traditions. For example, if you are Catholic in Guatemala or Italy, it is not uncommon for the practice of hiring what they call a wailer. The wailer laments loudly in grief. There will be priests that preside over the procession. It will be a foot procession rather than a vehicle procession, where they stop at various places that were important in the deceased's life. It's not uncommon for them to leave a penny at that crossroads of that site. These all have very superstitious beliefs behind them in those steps. Now, in the U.S., this is not something that's typically followed. You may see some remnants of it if you're in a state such as Louisiana. It's not something that's limited to just Catholics, though, in that region. But again, this is something that is more commonplace, where there's a high superstitious beliefs combined with religious beliefs, again, like those of Guatemala or Italy. During burial services for Catholics, there will be a priest presiding over burial, citing scripture from the Bible as the body is interred in the grave. The burial commonly ends with the priest throwing a handful of dirt on top of the coffin, or the family members and other attendants of the funeral will either do the same in throwing a handful of dirt or a flower. Well, typically flowers used are carnations, lilies, or roses. Some of the most common colors are red, pink, and white. These all have their own significance by both the flower and the color combination. They all mean something different, and it's symbolic of the individual's attachment to the deceased. For example, a red rose would denote a deep crimson rose, denotes a very deep grief, and is typically used by those closest to the deceased, such as a spouse. On the other hand, a white calla lily denotes restoring innocence upon the deceased. So, with respect to Protestant burial services, the primary difference there would be that the burial service is presided over by a minister or a pastor, as the Protestant faith does not have priests. There would be no sprinkling of the holy water over the gravesite or over the body like there is in the Catholic services. And some Protestants may throw dirt or flowers in the coffin as it's lowered into the ground. Very not dissimilar to the Catholic burial, but not as symbolic in the coloring or in the flowers that are utilized. With both faiths, it is not uncommon to have a reception after services have been completed. The reception is generally conducted like a potluck, with all attendees bringing a dish for group consumption. Though some of the receptions that are catered and prepared by neighbors in our small local church or community halls. With most receptions, this is a more casual environment where tenants freely move around, talking with each other over remembrance of the deceased, offering condolences to the bereaved family members. It's common to partake of food while standing, speaking amongst the group. In more formal receptions, these are like your catered event. There would be an allotted time for sitting and eating, preceded by and ending with remembrances shared amongst those attending. In the less formal settings, as the reception comes to the end, it's typical that those closest to the bereaved will step up and say the goodbyes to the other attendees. They'll facilitate cleanup on behalf of the family, as opposed to the more formal catered events where the catering company facilitates over the ending. When offering condolences to the family, it is appropriate in either faith to simply state that my condolences for your loss, if your ties to the family or deceased is that of an acquaintance. But if one is more closely tied to the family or the bereaved, it also is appropriate to express your grief as well in brief, heartfelt expressions such as, may the sorrow in your hearts be lightened by the love that surrounds you. These expressions of condolences can also be offered in variations of religious text, depending on how religiously devout the deceased or their family is or how religious you are yourself. If one is not in a position to offer condolences directly, either to a person or via phone, it's appropriate to send a card and or a floral arrangement to the family of the deceased with similar guidelines in the comments. In some instances, the family may make an announcement through an obituary in the newspaper requesting that donations be made in lieu of sending flowers. And in some instances, especially when the deceased has touched many lives, such as they were a pillar of the community or a local politician, they may give directions to make donations to a charitable organization in behalf of the deceased. So in these instances, the obituary will guide you and direct you as to how best to proceed. If selected, give a eulogy. It's important to confirm the level of the formality of the event with those in charge of the funeral. The more formal the occasion, in most cases, the more formal it is, the more likely it is a Catholic event, as they are more formal in general. These eulogies should be a more formal speech, more professional words used, more focused on the deceased's contributions and accomplishments in life. For example, if the deceased was a local mayor, it would be appropriate to discuss the more major milestones of their life and their career and any accolades or awards that they had received in their efforts as mayor. Whereas in a more informal setting, it would be appropriate to recall a story of a funny incident during childhood, something like a friend getting in trouble with the deceased in a humorous fashion. If the friend reciting the tale is attending a Catholic service, it should be a little bit more, again, formal. If attending a Protestant service, generally not as formal. Now, the Protestants typically focus on a celebration of life, which is why it's also more appropriate to talk about specific events that the individual shared with the deceased. This is not necessarily the case with the Catholic services, but again, it just depends on the amount of attendance and the formality of the event. This is something that will be directed to you by the deceased's family members or spouse. The more formal the event, the more cause to ensure that the appropriate dress is considered as well. Catholics typically dress in black or other very dark hues of clothing. It's generally more formal attire, such as a black suit and tie with a dark colored shirt for men. And for women, it's typically a black or dark colored dress, hose, heels. Protestants, on the other hand, tend to have a bit more casual range, from business casual, like slacks and a button-up shirt for men, and either a less formal dress or pants with a button-up blouse for women, to actually even casual wear, such as jeans or t-shirts in various colors. Again, this is something that the formality of the event will be your guide. This is how you would direct it. After services, depending on relationship ties with the deceased family, it's always appropriate to follow up to see how you can offer assistance in daily activities, cooking, cleaning, moving. All of these, again, the family will tell you. Funerals, regardless of cultural influences or religious preferences, they're somber occasions, and they're meant to honor and respect the deceased. Over the last several hundreds of years, especially in the U.S., some customs have changed, and many funerals in the modern era have become a celebration of life and tended to be less somber than they once were, but some traditions still remain timeless. Hopefully this review of American Catholic and Protestant funeral customs has been helpful in navigating through the sensitive topic of death.